For years, he had worked hard for stability, a steady job, a modest home in a neighborhood with quiet streets and freshly cut lawns. Owning a Dodge Charger was more than just about driving. It was a symbol of persistence, of pride, of finally getting something he had earned through sweat and sacrifice. Every Saturday morning, he would shine it until the paint reflected the sky, nodding politely at neighbors who both admired and envied it. But beneath the surface of the community, things were not as picture-perfect as they seemed. The Homeowners Association carried rules that seemed less about order and more about control. And at the center of it was one woman, the kind of neighbor who was always watching, always whispering, always ready to remind others of where they did or didn't belong. Most days, he ignored the stares and muttered complaints. After all, he was used to being underestimated. His focus was on his work, his family, and protecting the life he'd built, no matter how uncomfortable some people seemed with seeing him thrive. Yet all it takes is one moment for quiet resentment to turn into open hostility. One reckless action to unravel the illusion of peace. And for him, that moment would arrive on an ordinary afternoon when something precious disappeared from his driveway, setting off a chain of events no one in that neighborhood could have imagined. For years, he had worked hard for stability, a steady job, a modest home in a neighborhood with quiet streets and freshly cut lawns. Owning a Dodge Charger was more than just about driving. It was a symbol of persistence, of pride, of finally getting something he had earned through sweat and sacrifice. Every Saturday morning, he would shine it until the paint reflected the sky, nodding politely at neighbors who both admired and envied it. But beneath the surface of the community, things were not as picture-perfect as they seemed. The Homeowners Association carried rules that seemed less about order and more about control. And at the center of it was one woman, the kind of neighbor who was always watching, always whispering, always ready to remind others of where they did or didn't belong. Most days, he ignored the stares and muttered complaints. After all, he was used to being underestimated. His focus was on his work, his family, and protecting the life he'd built, no matter how uncomfortable some people seemed with seeing him thrive. Yet all it takes is one moment for quiet resentment to turn into open hostility. One reckless action to unravel the illusion of peace. And for him, that moment would arrive on an ordinary afternoon when something precious disappeared from his driveway, setting off a chain of events no one in that neighborhood could have imagined. The afternoon had started like any other. The sun hung low, casting sharp shadows across the neatly trimmed yards. But when he walked to the driveway, the empty space where his Dodge Charger should have been hit him like a punch to the chest. At first, he thought it had to be a mistake. Maybe he'd parked it around the corner, maybe he'd lent it to a cousin and forgotten. But deep down, he knew. That car was gone. His pulse quickened as he scanned the street. A neighbor watering her lawn avoided his eyes. A group of teenagers glanced over, then whispered, and it wasn't long before the name reached his ears. Karen's son. A young man known for arrogance, for sneers too sharp for his age, for comments you couldn't mistake for anything but hate. People in the neighborhood dismissed it as boys being boys. To him, it felt like a quiet warning no one else wanted to hear. Hours passed before he spotted the car again, swerving recklessly down the road. Music blasting from speakers he had paid for. In the driver's seat, Karen's son. And in that moment, anger burned hotter than fear. He had worked years to buy that car, cherished it, protected it, cared for it. Now it was being paraded around the neighborhood like stolen spoils. While the same boy who mocked him for the color of his skin grinned behind the wheel. By the time he confronted them, the damage was already done. Scratches along the door, muddy tracks on the carpet, the smell of smoke clinging to the seats. And instead of shame, Karen's son laughed in his face, as though nothing could touch him. But worse than the laughter was what came next, Karen herself storming into the street, her voice sharp with outrage, not at her son, but at the man whose car had been stolen. "Why are you harassing my child?" she shouted, loud enough for the entire block to hear. In an instant, the thief became the victim became the suspect, and neighbors peered through blinds as though the spectacle were entertainment. He remembered the sting of those eyes, the quiet judgment, the unspoken agreement that somehow he was the problem. And then came the sound that sealed the moment, the ring of a phone call. Karen dialing the police, her words quick, her tone deliberate, dripping with righteous indignation. She didn't just report a dispute over property. She painted a picture, a dangerous man threatening her innocent son. To anyone listening, it was the kind of story that ended in handcuffs. Or worse, he stood frozen, fury colliding with dread, because he knew exactly what could happen when police arrived to find a black man accused by a white neighbor. He had seen those stories before. Names in the news, faces lost too soon, an injustice repeated like a broken record. And now, he was the one in its path. The sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each second. Karen crossed her arms, smirking as though she knew how this would end. Her son leaned against the car he'd stolen, grinning through it all. Every second felt like an eternity, the weight of history pressing down. What they didn't realize, what neither of them could have predicted, was that the story wasn't theirs to control. Because when those flashing lights pulled up to the curb, they weren't coming to save Karen. They were coming face to face with the sheriff. The police cars screeched to a halt, red and blue lights bouncing across the manicured lawns. Doors slammed, radios crackled, and in seconds, the street was alive with authority. Neighbors pressed to their windows, phones raised, capturing what they thought would be an arrest. Karen's voice cut through the noise, shrill and commanding, weaving her story of fear and danger as though she had rehearsed it. A threatening man, intimidating her child, causing trouble again. The words stabbed deep. He knew their weight. He knew history had written thousands of tragedies in the ink of lies just like hers. And as the officer stepped forward, one hand sliding dangerously close to a holster, his heart slammed in his chest. For a fraction of a second, the world slowed. He wasn't just seeing this moment. He was remembering all the others. Hands up, knees pressed into the pavement, names turned into hashtags. Karen crossed her arms tighter, emboldened, certain justice was on her side. Her son chuckled behind her, still leaning against a car that didn't belong to him, confident that privilege would outweigh truth. The crowd held its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Then it happened. He reached into his pocket, deliberate, steady, unshaken. Gasps rippled through the air. And instead of panic, instead of shame, he pulled out something else entirely, the gleam of his badge. The silence was deafening. In one instant, the story shattered. The accused was the sheriff. The man Karen framed was the very authority she thought would protect her lies. The officers froze, confusion flashing across their faces. Neighbors who had cheered in whispers now reeled in shock. The power Karen thought she held slipped like sand through her fingers. Her smirk faltered. Her son's grin vanished, and in that charged silence, one truth became impossible to ignore. The system she tried to weaponize was staring back at her. The badge in his hand changed everything. The officers straightened, their postures shifting from suspicion to uneasy respect. Karen's certainty melted into stammered excuses, her son suddenly silent, his arrogance crumbling in the weight of exposure. Neighbors who had been eager to believe the worst now looked away, unable to reconcile the truth with the story they had convinced themselves was real. The charger was returned, its scratches still fresh, a reminder of what was stolen not just in property, but in dignity. Yet the deeper wound wasn't on the car at all. It was in the knowledge that even as a sheriff, even with all his authority, one false accusation, one twisted narrative could have ended differently. The truth is that his badge shouldn't have been the reason he was spared. His humanity should have been enough. In the days that followed, the incident rippled through the community. Whispers grew into conversations, though some tried to erase the memory as quickly as it had appeared. But others, those watching with phones in hand, those whose hearts sank at the sirens that day, couldn't forget. They had seen how fragile justice could be, how quickly lies could turn a man's life into a target. This wasn't just about a car or an HOA or even a single confrontation between neighbors. It was about a truth too many still deny. Racism doesn't always wear a uniform. but it always leaves a scar. And so the question lingers, not only for Karen, not only for that neighborhood, but for all of us. How many more lives will be gambled away before we realize that silence in the face of injustice is never neutral?